Uh, it's just 2 p.m., so let's start. I have a lot of stuff to share, so we should not be running too late. Welcome to my session. Now we are going to talk about FileMaker performance. Just brief introduction, this is me. I'm co-founder and co-owner of 2ForYou. We are Claris Platinum partner, and I personally have been developing with FileMaker since 1991, so it's 31 years now. I'm sometimes called the mad optimizer because when something is even fast, I still want to make it faster. And my passion is when I hear from someone that something is impossible, that rings the bell, and that's when I get interested and try to prove that it's possible, actually. Today I'm going to talk briefly about 2ForYou bench test. This tool that's free on our website that you can use. A little bit about Apple Silicon processors versus Intel processors. FileMaker 19.5, how it compares to 19.4. A new stuff, the FileMaker native transactions. Vince talked about them yesterday. I'm going to take performance angle of view on transactions. And a little bit about optimizing calculations as well. Even though calculations may seem something very small, very tiny, it still may make sense to make them run faster because they're everywhere in FileMaker. Let me start about bench test 2. Bench test is a tool that we originally created as a tool many years ago for FileMaker DevCon to compare different ways how to do same things in different ways. Later on, we started using it to compare different versions of FileMaker and how fast they are and how they compare to each other. But then it also is great to compare different environments. Like, do you want to deploy your solution to an on-premise server, this hosting, that hosting? What is the best in terms of performance? So it's a tool that you can download for free on our website. You can use these 14 tabs to specifically test different techniques and how to do the same thing in a different way and how fast it is depending on the number of records, for instance, that you run it on. There are standard tests. This is something that we came up with a little bit, I think, less than a year ago or about a year ago. You can use this to run the same standard test and compare it to other users. When you run the test, it collects 111 test results from your environment. Then it gives you a possibility to publish or submit the test results to our website. And when you submit it, it appears on our website compared to all the other users that submit the same standard test. So you can know how your environment, including FileMaker version, including the operating system, everything, how that compares in terms of performance to other people. You can score your environment. Instead of showing only the absolute values, how long each test takes, we are calculating a score based on how much faster your result is compared to our reference results that I collected on old Mac Pro. So if you're testing on a local network, on a locally open file, your score for every test should be higher than 1 if you don't have a 10 or 12-year-old machine like me for the reference result. So this score actually shows you how fast your environment is, and the higher value means faster results. You can see that compared in charts. If you collect 100 tests, you can just select a few of them to compare. And what's unique, and that's a new feature that was added this year, was comparing, and you can use it yourself, comparing the speed of running multiple users concurrently at the same time. Unlike, for instance, the Punisher solution that comes from Soliant for testing FileMaker server performance, which spins up multiple server-side scripts. This really tests real clients connected to FileMaker server. And the way it works is very simple. You put the bench test file on your server, you connect to it from the first client. That client becomes the master where you control the test execution. And then every other computer, every other client that connects to the bench test on the same server becomes a worker. And on the master, you just press a button to start a test, and all the workers start running the same test at the same time. So that's a proper test of multiple users. Now, this is the website that we have where we share the results online, and I think since April, it's split to 5 different tabs so that you compare comparable results. So the first one is for local files, file open locally on a hard drive with FileMaker Pro. Localhost means connecting from the same machine to the same machine running FileMaker server. Local network, obviously, are 2 computers on the same local network. We actually manage to find out that it's a local network by measuring the latency. So I believe the threshold for the latency is something like 1 millisecond or something like that. So if it's under 1 millisecond, we consider it a local network. Wide area network, obviously, is for comparing how your solution is going to behave when you host it on a server on the internet, in a cloud, including FileMaker Cloud. And multiple users, that's what I just explained about running multiple users at the same time. And just if you're curious, this is the setup where I ran the reference results, which represent the score 1 in all the tests. So whatever is faster than this setup will produce a score higher than 1. Now let me tell you a little bit about Apple Silicon versus Intel. I was expecting Apple Silicon processors to be fast, so I was just wondering how much fast they are. This is just part of my setup. My tests also included this M1 MacBook Pro, which is not on the picture, but I also tested M1 Mac Mini, which was in the other room. And my test results just confirmed that Intel is not as fast as the M1 processors, the Apple Silicon, and I was testing both just the pure power of the M1 processor and also running the FileMaker server on M1 Mac Mini and connecting it from the old Intel MacBook Pro. Now, this is even more interesting comparing Intel and Apple Silicon. These are the results from the actual users of bench test. And as you can see, this is where the fastest or the best results running a local file scored on an Intel machine. So I'm wondering whether someone is able to submit the better results from an Intel processor, but it definitely proves that Apple Silicon is fast running FileMaker. Now, when I ran it as a server, FileMaker server on a Mac, this is what it looked like. And again, from the tab on our website, from results submitted by bench test users, this is where Silicon Mac scored as a server on a local network. Considering the fact that there are no server-grade computers available from Apple, if we need just a decent server for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 users, and we can take care of like external hard drive for backups, and we don't mind that if the server dies, we will be without the database for a few hours before until we replace it. Mac Mini with the M1 processor or M2 is definitely a good choice. If you want more users, Mac Studio is the answer. Now, on a WAN, on a slow network, this is the best results we got so far, and we still don't have any better results from Intel. Okay, so that was briefly about bench test, and that's the tool that you can use. You can download it. I'll be glad if you all do and try it and submit your test results, because the more results we have, the more we can compare, and the more useful it will be for everyone. But this year, FileMaker 19.5 was released, and I guess you all know from the performance perspective what was the biggest news in 19.5, right? Someone wants to say? It's server-side summaries. So we expected that this will be a significant change, that FileMaker 19.5 can calculate summary fields on the server. First, I tried to test FileMaker, the complete standard test, all those 111 tests on both versions, and they were quite comparable. Although 19.5 generally was a little bit faster, but it was decent change. When running concurrent users on the LAN, in one case with the Mac Studio as a server, it was even faster slightly, running 19.4, but again, it was not significant. So I was wondering how the calculation of summary fields on the server affected my test results. In fact, the problem with calculating summary fields is that if you already have the data cached in a local cache in the client, it's not used. FileMaker Pro will simply use the local cache data to calculate your summary, and it will not use the feature of 19.5 for this. And because I run 111 tests, so the test that I run before testing summary fields and totals and aggregate functions caused the data to be loaded into local cache. So in the complete automated test, it was difficult to get it, to make sure that the data is not cached in on a local machine. So I ran a separate test by having 100,000 records, and I was trying to pick 40 of those records, or all 100,000, and calculate the total. I was using two methods. One was in both cases I was connecting to the records over a relationship. First method was using the sum function, which is an aggregate function that doesn't require additional field. The other one was creating a summary field in the related table. And I tested three different setups. One was the Mac Pro 2008 running Windows as a server, and I was connecting to it over the local network. The other one was the new Mac Studio over local network. And the third one was simulated WAN, where I used the Apple's network link auditioner to simulate a high latency network that you would get when hosting your server in a cloud. So this is the first result, calculating summary of 40 fields, and that was and over the LAN, and that was definitely something that it didn't really matter. If calculating total of your data takes 120 milliseconds, I bet that most of the time is just the operating system overhead. So this really doesn't matter which bar is wider. The next one is already interesting. When connecting to the Mac Pro, which is a slower machine, 19.5 got 9 times faster when calculating the summary field, but not with the aggregate function. So until 19.4, I kept saying that it doesn't really matter whether you use aggregate functions or summary fields. Now it's starting to matter. Summary fields, even though you have to create an extra field, make sense from the performance perspective. When the network becomes slower or the latency gets higher, it's also important. Now, this is a very fast machine, the Mac Studio, but also, thanks to the slow network, calculating the summary field on the server is 8 times faster. Now, when I combine that, when I use Mac Studio over a local network with 10,000 records, it's also significantly faster. In all cases, just the summary field, not the aggregate function. Now we have a Mac Pro on a local network. Slow server, 10,000 records, 75 times faster. So the slower your server is, the higher is the impact of 19.5 calculating summary fields on a server. That's the conclusion. But how about network? How much faster do you think 19.5 is calculating summary fields on a server when connecting over a slow network to a Mac Studio? Any guesses? 120 times. 340 times. So this is a huge difference. The point, however, is it needs to trigger. It needs to happen. So you have to be aware of when FileMaker will actually use this feature. The blue points here are what's published in the official Claris help. So it's obvious that this is documented. What's kind of expected, but it's not mentioned in the help, is that both version of the client and the server need to be at least 19.5. What is not mentioned there, but I found that by my testing, is that if the data is in a local cache, it's calculated locally. And what I was not sure about, and I was curious, are those aggregate functions. I don't know if they become using the same feature in the future, but for now, with 19.5, aggregate functions are not faster, summary fields are faster, and significantly. Now, thanks to the fact that native transactions coming in the new version of FileMaker have already been discussed and publicly demonstrated in Auto Live and yesterday in Win session. Even though this is not released yet, I can share a little bit of insight. So what I tried with the unfinished or unreleased version of 19.6 was what happens if I simply enclose my test in a single transaction. Is that going to have a significant impact? And in this case, I expected that it should have an impact, because if I only send the data to the server once instead of sending it for every record, it should be faster because I'm not waiting for that network latency for every single record, right? But how does it impact the replace field contents, which is a single script step? Is there going to be an impact or not? So what I found out was that there is an impact in how it happens or how FileMaker processes my requests. Although in the case of replace field contents, it does not have significant impact on the time. Surprising but not so weird effect with set field with transaction is that there was still a lot of time needed for FileMaker to lock those records, because even though it's a single transaction, for every single record when you touch it, FileMaker Pro still needs to send a request to the FileMaker server to lock that record so that it retains exclusive access to the record and no other user can modify it. So what was also interesting is that with the replace, there was a change in what happens. I was actually finding this out by checking the remote request log, which you can enable by adding a file called release debug on.txt to the folder where your FileMaker application is. And you get a log that shows you what's happening every time that FileMaker sends a request to the server and when it receives the response. So I found out that with replace, and I'll show you in detail here, so when running replace without transaction, it was actually doing that by groups of 500 records. So every 500 records sent 500 logs, then it sent the update, committed the update, and then it continued with another 500 records. So I was changing 1,000 records, but it was doing it in 2 pieces. When I switched to using a transaction, it changed not the time, but changed how it's doing it. So first it sent a log for every single record, and then it uploaded the updates of those 1,000 records all at once. With setField loop, for every single record, it was sending a log, that's one request, then it was uploading the change, another request, and then it was committing the change. I was using latency of 500 milliseconds, so you can imagine that for one record, it was 1.5 seconds. Weird thing that I discovered was that there were 1,003 instances of this combination instead of just 1,000. I haven't found out why, but when I tried the test again, it was 1,003 again. So if someone finds out, I will be glad to learn what's causing this. But again, it's obvious that the time is a factor of the latency mostly. When I ran the setField loop as a single transaction, as mentioned, it was still sending 1,000 requests to the server to log those individual records. It was not sending all the updates in one request, but it was splitting all the requests by 1 megabyte. So there is another thing that's a factor of the speed for you, and that's the size of the record. As you know, or may know, when you change a record, even if you change just a single field, FileMaker always sends the whole record to the server. And then all the other clients have to download the whole record from the server. So if you have a table with 100 fields, and you often change 5 fields in that table, and all the remaining 95 fields are only rarely changed, there is a good it's a good reason to split that table into 2 tables and maintain a one-to-one relationship between them, because only those 5 fields will need to be transferred every time you change one of them. So in the end, this was the result of trying it without monitoring the log. The first results were a little bit affected by the fact that I was connected to the machine I used for testing, and I was watching the transaction log in real time. So I ran the same test again 3 times without monitoring the logs, and this was the result. So as you can see, setField loop within a single transaction is almost equally fast as replace field contents compared to setField with loop without reusing the transaction. But still, the time saving that you get is about 50%. And you cannot get much past that unless you optimize also the record size and things like that. So it makes sense to use the new transactions to speed up things, but don't expect too much, because you will still need to rely on those logs being sent for every single record you touch. So that's about new transactions. And now the most problematic topic for me, because this year I realized that for 30 years I was making decisions based on a wrong assumption. And let me start with this slide, which explains why, in my opinion, calculations are so important in terms of performance. Originally, we only had calculation fields back in FileMaker Pro 1, 2, the old versions. Then we got scripts, then we got conditional formatting, record level privileges, custom menus, and with every new major upgrade of FileMaker, we are getting more places where we can use calculations. And although it takes us for some time to pick up and start using it, it is beneficial from the feature and possibilities point of view. But as we keep adding more calculations to our solutions, we keep adding pieces of code that need to be executed and slowing it down. And for instance, if we use, just to give you a sense, if you use list view with 10 fields on it and apply a conditional formatting with 4 rules, and you have a layout that displays 25 rows at the same time, and if you have a calculation in the conditional formatting that takes 10 milliseconds to execute, do you think it's too much or not? Normally, 10 milliseconds doesn't matter, right? But every single condition is calculated. Even if you have 4 conditions, all 4 are evaluated. If you have the conditional formatting applied to all 10 fields, they are all evaluated. What's more, they are evaluated 4 times, because there is a normal state, there is on-hover state, there is active field state, and there is one more. Anyway, there are 4 states, and FileMaker, in order to be able to respond quickly to your actions, pre-calculates the conditional formatting for all the 4 states for every single field. So it's 4 states times 4 conditions, that's 16, times 10 fields, that's 160, times 25, and you have to multiply this number by the 10 milliseconds. And that happens every time you want to refresh that list view. So calculations do matter, and they need to be fast in some cases. So that leads me to how I discovered that I was wrong with one of my assumptions. I was working on a custom function where I needed to iterate through a lot of numbers. So I discovered that it's slower than I would like to be, and I found some weird glitches there. So I also submitted this challenge in social networks. And I was wondering who comes up with the fastest way how to iterate through 10,000 or 100,000 values and calculate the total. Obvious potential approaches include recursive custom function. I didn't use that because I knew that while is proven to be faster in this case. So I didn't even test that. But using while function was an obvious answer. I was normally using the get value. So if you iterate from number 1 to the number of items, you use get value function to get the value that you need to work with. Then you get it. It was kind of intuitive that get value will get as slow as far you want to look in the list, because it needs to find all the character returns from the beginning to the value that you want to extract. I originally thought that using position and middle would be faster, because I always start with in the middle of the string, know where I want to start, which is the position which I calculated in the previous iteration. So I thought that would be much faster than get value. Another approach which can be only used in rare cases is evaluate. So for instance, if you want to calculate the total of a list of numbers, you can just insert plus between all those numbers. You get a valid FileMaker calculation and you can evaluate it. So that was another approach. The discovery that was very hard for me, obviously, as I mentioned, get value intuitively should be slower the farther you want to look in the list. Middle and position, I would assume they would be faster. So the position where you want to extract the value should not matter, but it does matter. And it actually does matter more than for the get value. So when I replaced get value with position and middle, my calculation became much slower. So that's why I started the challenge, and I was wondering who comes up with the best result. So this is what I found out, and that was my way to optimize it. I discovered that when I use replace to just delete the first value from the list, and the next iteration just takes the first value from the list again, now it became much faster, almost linear. But there were people who came up with even better results. One person, or actually two people, used the evaluate, which was kind of cheating for me, but it's a valid point, because if you can use evaluate, it's much faster. On the other side, if you don't have the option to use evaluate because you cannot turn your list into a valid calculation easily, and you still need to iterate through the values, then it's good to also know that you can use chunking. Chunking means that you use the middle values function, which turns out to be very fast. And if you have a list of 100,000 values, you can get a chunk of 1,000 values from wherever in the list, like in the middle, wherever you want. And if you just iterate through that small chunk, it's much faster. So you split the big list to a smaller list and iterate through them. Funny was that if we combined this method with the replace method, we got even better results. So in the end, we got very close to whatever we could get with the evaluate for the iterating. So this is the winning calculation to calculate the total of a list of values without using evaluate. So the highlight part here is the key. So the first part in the top is the chunking, and the second part is the replace method. What's interesting is that the chunk size, which is set in the beginning, is not the same, or the optimal chunk size is not the same for all cases. So depending on what kind of values you work with, in one case the chunk size, the best chunk size for best performance turned out to be about 3,000. In another case, it was about 600. So it's good to have a calculation like this if you really care about maximum performance. It's good to produce a function like this and calculate it in a loop where trying different chunk sizes to find out which chunk size for your use case is the best. Now, this is quite like a science or laboratory kind of approach to optimizing calculations, and I guess most of you don't normally need to produce a custom function that iterates through 100,000 items, right? So I was wondering how it applies to something that is actually used in the real world relatively often, and that's Virtualist. How many of you know what Virtualist is? Okay, most of you. So that's great. It's a technique introduced very long time ago by Bruce Robertson, and the idea of Virtualist is that instead of natively working with data where FileMaker decides when it needs to talk to FileMaker server, you just call a FileMaker script on the server, get the data to the client, and then you work with the data locally because it's stored in global variables. So for this to work, you need to request the data from the server. The server needs to get the data, send it back, and then you work with the data using calculations. And that's the part of Virtualist where the speed of calculations matter. Back a few years ago, I ran a test where I compared the different methods of displaying a virtual list, including JSON formatted values and tab delimited values. And that time I discovered, in most cases, tab delimited is much faster. So unless you deal with very short virtual list, where it doesn't really matter, and where the structure of JSON actually helps you to develop easier, using tab delimited values is much better. But now the experience with the calculations this summer made me think about questions that I never asked myself, like, is it better to use numbers or text? I actually discovered with the speed of position and middle that FileMaker is actually poor with working with text in compared to numbers. It's much faster to multiply two numbers or divide two numbers than to extract single character from a string. So I thought, okay, if I'm getting data from the server and it's like numbers, and if I know that all those numbers are integers and they fit within a specific range, like 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 1 million, I can combine multiple numbers into one just by multiplying them by some constant, and then I can extract those numbers the opposite way by calculating mod and diff and extracting one number from bigger number. And with this approach, I got the virtual list 1.8 times faster compared to tab delimited values. And in this case, I was working with about 7,000 records and 5 fields. So if you work with more fields, like if you're displaying some financial information, where this can be applied quite easily, you can get significant speed improvement by using numbers instead of combining numbers into one instead of using tab delimited values. But then I try to apply the knowledge from optimizing that calculation, iterating through 100,000 records, and using combine the numbers with my replace approach to iterating through the list. And I got it 15 times faster. And when I applied the chunking as well, I got it 691 times faster than the JSON method that I tested in the first place. So this was a breakthrough telling me, okay, something that 3 years ago I optimized and make it significantly faster than JSON, I could still make it 10 times faster now by applying my new knowledge from this year. So my top optimization tips for this year, based on this experience, is fix your calculations. You don't have to believe me, but I think many of your existing calculations can be much faster even without Claris changing a single line of code in FileMaker. And I saw my calculations getting 10 times or 100 times faster. So if you have calculations where it matters, like conditional formatting, hide object when, calculating record level privileges, those are the high exposed calculations. Try to look at them. There can be a lot of value for you in terms of optimization. Now, do prefer math over strings? It has now been proven that FileMaker is much better with numbers than with strings. It may have something to do with the fact that I'm not sure how current version of FileMaker stores data internally, because the full Unicode range of characters doesn't even fit all characters in in 2 bytes. Some characters needs 4 bytes. So I'm not sure if there is a constant size of one character internally in a string. Another thing is I don't know how FileMaker stores styles within a text value, if they are stored separately or if they are inline in the text. If they don't have constant size per character, that might be a way for Claris to optimize how they work with strings. But for us, the key takeaway for now is that replace middle values, middle position, get value, even left and right functions are something that we should at least question when we work with them in terms of performance and consider other options. While replace and middle values are extremely efficient and fast functions. That's also good to know. There is one bug in FileMaker which was revealed by Alex Zuev on Claris community. And that's when you use some of those string functions, like if you extract first 10 characters from a string that takes 1 megabyte, FileMaker actually allocates memory for the whole copy of the original string instead of just those 10 characters, which makes calculations much slower because it keeps eating your memory. But there is a workaround. If you pretend your calculation with the empty string and concatenate it with the result of the function, it will not eat that memory. So that's also something to consider. One good thing is staying current. Now, I think for the last few years is already my approach that I can suggest. Actually, starting from 19.2, I can definitely recommend it, because Claris does pay attention to performance and they make improvements in every version. So staying current with FileMaker is actually a good approach in terms of performance now. Now, based on my experience and that I was making assumptions in a wrong way for 30 years, I cannot recommend enough. Don't assume anything. Measure. Measure how things fast are, compare them, and only base your decisions on the measurements. And do not expect anything given, because the next version of FileMaker can change things, like with the summary field. So it was good to use aggregate functions until now. Now it seems to be better to create that extra summary field and use that. I was always recommending to focus on bottlenecks, because if you have solution that with 1,000 scripts and 100 tables and 1,000 layouts, if you optimize everything except the bottleneck, no one will care. But if you optimize the bottleneck and nothing else, everyone will like you, because the bottleneck is what's causing all the problems. So make sure to identify bottleneck, and we have a tool for that called FMBadge, if you don't know it. Identify bottleneck properly, find out what is your bottleneck, and even if you don't know how to optimize it, don't give up, and don't focus on anything else if you care about optimization. Focus on that bottleneck. It may be very difficult to optimize it. In one case, we discovered our bottleneck is one single relationship. And we had to figure out how to change that relationship to make the solution faster. We were deleting fields, we were deleting other relationships. But by focusing on that bottleneck, we finally found a way and made it 60 times faster. And the last thing, get help. Don't be shy. Share your questions, problems with the community. As you saw, I was able to optimize my calculation with the replays, but by sharing the challenge in the community and getting other approaches, I could make it even twice as fast as the fastest I could do myself. So by joining the forces together, we could come up with the fastest calculation to iterate through 100,000 values. So that's what I had for today. I have a few links here for you. The first one takes you to the web page where we have the tools, including FMBench, bench tests, on all the other ones. If you go to our news page, you will find articles where you can learn things, videos, etc. The third link leads to sample files that include the FileMaker test files with the calculations that I show you, even the Virtualist test, so you can play with them yourself. The fourth one, for fast calculations, that's an idea that I submitted to Claris community for the future of FileMaker. I will appreciate if you all go to that link and vote for that idea if you haven't done that yet. The idea is simply making the calculation engine faster, because as I mentioned, calculations are everywhere. And making the calculation engine faster in FileMaker will make all our solutions faster without us having to change a single bit. Taking advantage of the summary fields, we can only take advantage of that if we calculate some summary fields or totals in a data that's not cached, and only if we use summary fields and not aggregate functions. If we use aggregate functions, we have to change our code to use summary fields in order to take advantage of that feature in 19.5. Transactions in 19.6, you saw that we can get some performance benefit from it, but only if we use those features. So we have to go to the solution, to our scripts, and put there the open transaction, commit transaction at minimum in order to be able to take advantage of this, of the performance benefit of the transactions. But if the calculation engine becomes faster, we don't have to change anything. And every single FileMaker solution out there will benefit from that. So that's why, in my opinion, this is a very good thing to consider on the Claris side. And last question, or last request for me is help me to make my presentations even better in the future. So if you use the last link and provide me feedback to my session, I'll be glad for that, so that I can reflect that and improve in the future. And now I'm ready for questions.
Hi. Thanks for the great explanations you gave. It was eye-opening. I have one question about the statistics beforehand, where you were comparing with commits, with transactions, without transactions. Did you test that as one user on that table, or in something like a real-life situation where you have like 5 users working on the same table and then still doing your tests?
This was only a single test with a single user, so it's just a quick test to find out what's happening behind the scenes. So obviously, the situation may be different with multiple users. What is important to consider with the single transaction is, just like with the replace field contents, every single lock will remain until you commit the changes. So for instance, if you try to change 1,000 records in a single transaction, and those records are likely to be accessed by other users at the same time, until you commit the transactions, the other users will not be able to modify them. And this is actually a good reason to watch Vince Menano's presentations from the previous years, where he presented something he called being optimistic in the pessimistic world, because FileMaker's approach to transactions and to committing records is pessimistic. They simply assume that someone else will want to access that record at the same time. So to make sure it doesn't happen, that the collision doesn't happen, they lock the record and keep it locked until you commit. Optimistic approach that Vince's local file editing uses is that you edit the data locally and optimistically expect or assume that no one else will change those records until you are finished. And only at the time you're finished, you submit all the changes in a single transaction with a single call of a server-side script. And that script only logs all those records for a fraction of a second. And if there was no change in those records before you submitted the change, it will succeed. So that's an optimistic approach. And it's much harder to implement. It takes a lot of effort, but there are cases where this is 1,000 times better solution, especially if you work with many users and with a long high latency, like over the seas and etc.
Honza, quick question about so the summary fields. You're recommending that people start using them again, especially if you're 19.5, and then the other question is the get summary function. Is that just an aggregate function, or is that using the summary fields? Because it uses the summary fields. So
yeah, get summary function uses the summary field. So the summary field will calculate on the server as long as all the conditions are met. To make the decision whether it's worth the effort to switch from aggregate functions to summary field, that depends on how many times you actually happen to have the data you summarize on the server and not locally cached. I think that's the key differentiator. If you load the data and display it to the user, then you are probably going to have the data cached on a local machine. But if you only care about the totals and never access the data directly, then they are very likely going to be on the server only, and that's the moment where you can significantly benefit from using the summary fields calculated on the host.
And another question is, in the test that you ran, did you get rid of the cache sometimes, like the local cache?
Actually, that was the reason why I run the test separately, because when I run it as part of the standard test with all those 111 tests, there was no way to automatically get rid of the cache. But for these manual run tests with the summary fields, my procedure was to close FileMaker, delete the cache, open FileMaker, connect to the file, run my test, close it, delete the cache, open it again, and I was doing it for every single test.
When you mentioned the summary fields compared to aggregate functions, have you read out the summary fields, summary field values from a relationship, or
Yes.
have you first navigated to a found set?
No, it was through the relationship.
Okay. Thank you.
So the context was the same. I was accessing the records over relationship, and the only difference was whether I calculate use the aggregate function or access the summary field through the relationship. But everything else was the same. Any more questions? Okay, then I guess we are done. Thank you for your attention.